this is Shelby with Rogers Public Library. So this week for Full Steam Ahead, I want to talk about something a little bit different, and namely biology, and more specifically the origin of life. And sometimes this is called abiogenesis, right? Or how non-living things became living things. So just really quick, I want to kind of give us a definition of life to work with. So you can say that life is something that does all of these things. So it grows, it metabolizes, it self-regulates, it reproduces, it evolves, it responds to its environment, and it has cells. So some of these are kind of self-explanatory. I'm going to elaborate. Metabolism, that's eating food and using it to create energy. Or in the cases of plants, turning water and carbon dioxide into oxygen and using that to create energy. This is a little bit more complicated. And then self-regulation or homeostasis, that's maintaining our internal conditions. So that can mean temperature in the case of humans or other warm-blooded creatures, but not necessarily, because it's also kind of a little bit of a broader idea. But it's also important to point out that just because some things do some of the things on this list doesn't mean they're living. So crystals grow, but they don't evolve or reproduce. And the sun maintains its own temperature, but it doesn't grow. And so they're not really living things. The other thing is that there's kind of some elements to this question that aren't necessarily scientific, right? So when we talk about how life came from not life, there's our philosophical and theological aspects to that question. I don't want to talk about those. I want to talk about science. And specifically the science of what conditions on Earth made it possible for life to exist here when we don't really have any evidence of life existing elsewhere in the galaxy for the most part. And so probably the most important thing is water, right? Is specifically liquid water. Now, water is pretty common in the universe because hydrogen and oxygen, its components are really common. And when those two elements are together, they tend to form water just by themselves. But liquid water isn't, right? Most of the water in the universe is frozen, or it's in the form of water vapor, right? Kind of dissolved into the air. But liquid water is pretty rare. And there's a couple places in the universe besides Earth that has it. So there's a little bit of liquid water on Mars in the summer, and there's some on a couple different moons. And we kind of define that parts of a system where liquid water can exist as the Goldilocks zone or the habitable zone. And so those are places that are between 0 and 100 degrees Celsius, where life can exist because liquid water exists. And as for why water is particularly important, as well, it's a really good solvent, right? So you can dissolve a lot of different things, and when those things are floating around in the water, they can interact with each other really well. Like, our bodies are for the most part made out of water, and the different molecules that are inside of us interact with each other while they're floating around. Water also has a really high thermal capacity. And that just means that it takes a lot of temperature to increase the temperature of water, right? And that keeps the temperature on Earth stable, right? So that we're not getting really cold and freezing and not getting really hot, and then all the water escapes into the atmosphere and goes into outer space. Water is also really important because it blocks UV radiation. Now, UV radiation or ultraviolet radiation is a really harmful type of electromagnetic energy that comes from the sun. And it damages molecules and causes them to break apart. So in the early days of the Earth, when there wasn't really any oxygen in the atmosphere, all living things lived in the oceans because that kept them from getting destroyed by ultraviolet radiation. And to kind of give you a sense of how damaging ultraviolet radiation is, I did a little science experiment right here. See, on this one, I wrote UV, and I wrote on this one control, right? So on both of these, I got a little bit of puddle water from outside, and I split it between the two bottles. But before that, I disinfected it just to make sure there wasn't a lot of germs in one of them and not the other. Then I this one, and I put it in our UV disinfector here at the library, just to kill off any organisms that might have been living in the water bottle. And after that, oh, that's not good. After that, I got the lids from each of them, and I cut a hole in them and I hot glued a straw in. And that's just for the purpose of letting air in and out of the bottle without letting dust or anything else get in that might contaminate the samples. And then I cut up a cube of fish food and I put half of it into either bottle. You can also do this experiment with something like plant food. And it's been about 2 weeks now, and there's a little bit of bacterial growth in this one, but it's not nearly as much as in this one. And while I was talking, I noticed the bacterial mat that was in this guy fell to the bottom, whereas this one is still floating at the top. I'm going to add a little bit of India ink to these. So India ink, you can get this at a craft store or at a art supply store, but it's also used as a biological stain, and that just means that it's added to samples, in this case our water bottles, and it will mix in and it will stain, but it won't stain cells, right? It'll just mix in with the water, and you're supposed to be able to use it to see your samples better. Ooh, that smells gross. And I think it goes without saying that this water is really gross and yucky. And when I'm done with this, I'm just going to throw them out because they're not really something you want to mess with, right? Okay. Maybe that wasn't a great idea. I think I added too much to these. You can't really see them anymore. But with this one thing that I did notice was that there was a little bit of green specks in it that wasn't in this one, right? The one that I didn't expose to UV radiation didn't have any green specks, whereas this one did. This one also had significantly less bacterial growth. And I think that's because, so the green specks are chlorophyll, or creatures that contain chlorophyll inside of them. And chlorophyll, if you didn't know, is fluorescent, and that means that it absorbs UV radiation. And so I'm thinking that those organisms wouldn't have been as harmed when they're exposed to UV radiation as the other bacteria, and so they could grow a little bit better than in the control bottle. And as for why we had any bacterial growth in the UV bottle at all, well, that could have just been I messed up somewhere along the way. I either let the bottles get contaminated again, or or when I added the food, a little bit of bacteria got into this bottle on accident. So I think that should kind of give you a sense of the ways that UV radiation is harmful. And like I said before, water protects against UV, but so does oxygen. And that's why that things can live on land now. But that wasn't the case. In the Earth's early atmosphere, there wasn't really any oxygen by itself, but there was in the form of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. And oxygen came later, when plants or when organisms evolved to perform photosynthesis. And this was the Great Oxidation Event. So at that point, a lot of the creatures on Earth were really affected by oxygen. They weren't, oxygen is really reactive, right? It forms a lot of oxides and like chemicals, right? So if you ever see something that looks rusty, that's because oxygen has damaged the metal that it's made out of. So early life forms didn't do well with oxygen, but now that we've evolved to handle it and to use our breathing to use oxygen to produce energy, it's let more complex forms of life evolved on the land in bigger forms of life as well. And then there's another thing that I want to point out about the Earth that makes it particularly good for sustaining life, and that is the fact that inside the Earth there's a big ball of molten iron and nickel. And when this ball of molten metal swishes around, it creates a magnetic field, and this magnetic field protects us from other types of radiation from the sun that would otherwise harm us in the form of something called a magnetosphere, right? So there's a big magnetic field that goes all around the Earth, and this magnetic field is what lets compasses point north, and it's also what creates aurora borealis, or the northern lights, if you've ever seen that, or you've heard grown-ups talk about it before. And so for our experiment for today, I thought that we would kind of look at this origin of life thing from a little bit of a different angle. So this is a sensory jar in the form of primordial soup, right? Just sometimes a metaphor that people use to talk about early life. And I wanted to create kind of the conditions of life on early Earth with it. So we have blue water, so water with a little bit of blue food coloring in it to represent the liquid water. And then this vegetable is kind of for contrast, but also when you shake it, you see these little bubbles form, and they're kind of like cells, right? Or little organic matter floating around in envelopes. And then I don't think you can see them very well, but I cut up a little pieces of plastic cups like this, and I wrote the names of different chemicals that were in the Earth's atmosphere on them. So there's CO2 or carbon dioxide, H2O, water, SO2, sulfur dioxide, NH3, ammonia, CH4, methane. And some of these chemicals, most of these chemicals, we still have them on Earth now, and some of them, they come out of volcanoes when they spew volcanic gases and ash and all that gross stuff, particularly the sulfur dioxide and the methane. And then another thing about that is that when this happens, when volcanoes spew a bunch of ash like that, it creates static electricity, and the static electricity will build up until it eventually produces lightning. But we can't really simulate lightning in our sensory jar like we might want to if we were trying to be particularly realistic. But other than that, it's pretty cool. I also added a little bit of gold glitter just because I thought it was fun. And of course, you don't have to use a mason jar. You can also use a bottle like this if you have one. I think it might have been a water bottle at one point, or you can just use a simple bottle or a water bottle like this, right? And then it kind of goes without saying, but when you're done with your sensory jar, if you don't want it anymore, don't dump the oil down the sink because it can clog up your drain. Just a life hack for you. But that's what I had for you guys this week. I hope you had fun and you learned something, and I'll see you next time.